youth connectedness. He developed Family Finding, a set of strategies now utilized throughout North America, Australia, and Western Europe to engage networks of family members and other important adults to promote the safety, healthy development, and healing of children and youth involved with government systems. Kevin has been an administrator, director, and vice president of private social service agencies for over 30 years. Kevin is the senior child welfare consultant for CVS Aetna, America's largest healthcare partner, where he is assisting Aetna to implement a new approach to health and mental health care for all children involved in the child protection system in response to the special healthcare population they represent and the opportunity to promote their health development and lifelong health. Kevin's work has twice been featured on CBS 60 Minutes with Leslie Stahl, as well as in the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Time Magazine, and dozens of other national and international publications. He continues to speak on the issues of youth and families throughout the world and has published a number of articles on the need for radical reform of America's child protection, children's mental health, and juvenile justice systems. We are honored today to have Kevin Campbell with us. And so without further ado, Kevin, I will pass the microphone to you.
Thank you so much. That's very kind, and I appreciate your reading that lengthy bio. What a great opportunity, and I'm thrilled to connect with colleagues in California. I'd love to acknowledge California's leadership. First of all, I have been connected to. I'm actually originally from Los Angeles as a child, although I grew up here in Washington State. But my connections over the years to California, to the department, to the county agencies, and to other partners in the state have been really profoundly important in my own learning and my own development. And I just want to acknowledge you as an extraordinary state in so many ways. And I feel very privileged to talk with you today. I was on a call earlier. Elizabeth Wendell, who is a dear colleague of mine from Philadelphia, she and I were on a coaching call with our partners in North Yorkshire, England, right before this call. And we had an experience with this group of wonderful child protection partners that really made me ask her a last minute question, which is whether she would join me in this talk today. And she was kind enough to agree to do that at the last minute. So I want to acknowledge Elizabeth's going to jump in from time to time in this conversation and lead us through a particular activity together. So I just want to acknowledge Elizabeth, and who led the Family Finding Unit for the city of Philadelphia for 10 years and worked to engage the families of more than 10,000 children who were in care over those years. And that project continues to operate, although Elizabeth left that project and works with me with Aetna Better Health, and also in a variety of projects around the world and in California. The power of connection. When as you were reading my bio at the end, the notion of radical reform, I'll be very simple. The radical reform I speak of fits this topic really, really well, and we're going to come at it in a variety of ways in the short time we've got together today. I want to start in a prevention context. If we talk, as you all know, this is National Child Abuse Prevention Month in the United States. And I want to frame that prevention opportunity in some interesting ways to set the tone here. A person you may not know of, but has influenced all of your lives, is a man who in 1942 was appointed by Winston Churchill during World War II to write a report about how to reform the social welfare programs in Britain. By 1942, Britain had been on the tip of the spear fighting Nazi aggression for some years without yet active involvement of the United States, although we did declare war against the Germans and Japanese homeland in December of 1941. But by 1942, we had not quite ramped up yet, and England, was facing an existential threat, and they really could not afford to continue to make any sorts of investment of treasure in anything that didn't deal with protecting the homeland. And that forced something unique to happen that's only happened a few times in world history. And that's when a major world power turned its full attention to the problems of poor people in their society and their social welfare programs. And they hired William Beveridge, who was a economist by training and a social engineer by reputation. He's also a strong believer in eugenics. And he ended up writing a report that's broadly known today as the Beveridge Report. This Beveridge Report became the template for the modern welfare state in the Western world, including here in the United States. Beveridge was a frequent visitor to the Roosevelt White House during the war and laid the foundation for what became the Great Society programs in the 1960s with Lyndon Johnson, including the creation of Medicare or Medi-Cal. What you call Medi-Cal is Medicaid, later 4E, 4B, and the other entitlement programs that we've been living with since that time. And he said at that particular moment, he said, a revolutionary moment in the world's history is a time for revolutions, not for patching. And I want to borrow from Beveridge here and say that we are living in revolutionary times for so many reasons. And in the context of speaking about prevention of child abuse, this is a revolutionary time, and it calls for revolutionary leadership and action, not simply for band-aids of particular narrow problems. And I want to set the stage, and my hope today is to leave you more equipped with a variety of ideas about that might inform what we do with this revolutionary time, how we approach this extraordinary opportunity we have, maybe for the first time in the nation's history, to have a very serious, actionable conversation about prevention. I put a Rumi quote up here. I use a lot of Rumi quotes. In a 4th century Sufi mystic who said many wise things, but one he said was, maybe you are searching among the branches for what only appears in the roots. And I want to take that notion of looking to the roots of the opportunities and challenges that we face as we construct a revolutionary approach, I hope, to and just approach to the opportunity of preventing the significant early life adversities and harm that children might otherwise face in our society without these sorts of changes. Elizabeth, let's go ahead and change the slide. So as I said, revolutionary times call for revolution. As I've said, we're moving into a meaningful and actionable conversation about prevention. I remember in the early 1990s, some prevention conversations here in Washington State with the legislature, and the constant challenge we had when, I had been a foster parent for older teenagers. I ran an agency that included residential care, foster care, and wraparound work here in Washington. But and nobody, I knew that the best opportunity we really had was to prevent the kinds of harms that happened, rather than be in a position with foster care and institutions to respond to them after the harm had been done. But at that moment, the conversation with the legislature typically very quickly devolved to a particular statement repeatedly, which was described as, you can't prove a negative. You can't prove to policymakers that making an investment in prevention results in any sort of return on investment, because if you prevented it, how do we know it ever would have happened? And we seem stuck in that place for a long time, and that is clearly not the place we find ourselves in 2021. And that is maybe one small example, despite so many hardships, of the progress we have persistently been making in the United States. Despite setbacks, we've continued to make progress over the last 25 or 30 years. And I'm very hopeful. I find myself very hopeful about what the next decade will really bring to us in terms of transformation. I would add that what fuels this view that I have of this as a revolutionary time is that there's been an extraordinary revolution in the biological sciences and neurobiology and genomics over the last 30 years that builds a new evidentiary lens to view the opportunities of transforming systems intended to help families and kids. I'm not talking here about the worn narrative for the last 25 years of evidence-based models, discrete models as the promise of reform. I mean, what we have the opportunity to do is to build a foundation of or stand on a foundation of bedrock evidence that's evolved over the last 30 years out of the biological sciences, out of neurobiology, and out of genomics and epigenetics. That really is transformative. And Elizabeth and I are working on implementation projects around the world based on that evidence and seeing extraordinary impacts. And I should mention, not just outside the United States, but inside the United States. Finally, new longitudinal research from around the world can move us to a new position in our collective opportunity to stand in the place where we can do the most good and more deeply consider what we mean by prevention and whom it includes and whom it excludes. And I want to take a moment here and do something that's going to be really important, I think. And that is, I'm going to begin today with something I often do, which is to begin with an apology. I learned this from a dear colleague, former founder and former director at the National Indian Child Welfare Association, who happens to be a member of the Seneca Nation of Indians in upstate New York and in southern Ontario, Canada. And in the tradition of the Seneca people, when one has an opportunity to speak to wise people, as Elizabeth and I do today, if we're honored to do this, in the Seneca tradition, one begins with an apology. And I want to apologize to you now for anything that I may say or Elizabeth may share today that is wounding or brings you discomfort or harm. We accept responsibility for that discomfort and creating it, but I also want to say to you, it's not our intention to be wounding, but some of the information we're going to provide in terms of new longitudinal research that has come to us in the last few years in the world may be new to you and is extremely difficult. The longitudinal, by the way, we're looking at up to 42 years of longitudinal data on what's happened in terms of the health and mental health of people from three continents who had spent any time as children in foster care or institutional care. We have new information about that on a very large scale, and I presented you because it's important to tell the truth, but it is painful. But I also offered in a particular context because how privileged are we today as we devote our one sacred life to the work we've each chosen to do, to be armed with knowledge that we did not have before and that those who came before us did not have. I mean, we have that knowledge, and I think what is exciting and revolutionary is our ability to think about how to use it. How do we use that knowledge? So let's go ahead and move to the next slide. I'm sorry. So Elizabeth and I were on a call earlier today with our wonderful colleagues in North Yorkshire, which is a local authority, effectively a county in the north of England, not far from Scotland on the coast. And we think that North Yorkshire may be an example of one of the best functioning child protection systems anywhere in the world. And we're thrilled that we've got a long-term relationship with North Yorkshire to work together to build a model of practice in North Yorkshire that is fit for purpose for their context. And we're moving into a new phase in our work with North Yorkshire about implementing what we call a culture or a family meeting culture. In other words, it's really about that we think at the heart of the transformation we need to confront is a relationship to power between child protection agencies, parents, young people, grandparents, and communities. And one of the challenges of systems not consistently gathering the family together and doing the work together of building safety and healing is that, but the not doing that has an impact in terms of people's ability to find self-determination in their work. And it's really a struggle about how we use our power in our practice. And so we were thrilled to be preparing for a new phase in the work in North Yorkshire around that issue of power. And the language that was coming up, which is some beautiful language, was just what my Australian colleagues call shining a light on good practice. And what we heard today was the North Yorkshire people were using the term pearls to describe a way that we would call shining a light on good practice, the pearls of practice that they see with their practitioners and with their leadership and with families and with young people. And it's beautiful language, but it had a different meaning for Elizabeth and I. And unfortunately, as you'll see in a minute, it may have a very specific and different meaning for you in California. But we think this is an important conversation to have, and it's a way to engage you as an audience and make this a conversation rather than a lecture. So I'm going to ask Elizabeth to lead you through an exercise about pearls. So if you could do that, Elizabeth.
Sure. Thanks, Kevin. So this is a simple exercise, and it'll only take a couple of minutes, but I am going to ask you to react. So just use the chat function as you're able. And I'll echo Kevin's sentiments. This activity is not meant to be painful or wounding, but maybe in some ways. And so just pay attention to that as I tell these two stories. So I'm going to tell a first story here about a little girl. And I would encourage you to just identify what comes to your mind as you're hearing this story. What words do you use to describe this person? What reactions do you feel in your body, in your brain? Feel free to just pop them in the chat. So I'm just going to briefly tell the story of this little girl. So this little girl is born in 1983. Both her parents are present when she's born. But very quickly after she's born, her dad ends up getting convicted of a pretty serious crime and sent to prison. And she and her mother are left alone. Eventually they have to move because their housing situation becomes pretty unstable. Her mother gets more and more agitated as the days, weeks, and months go on, becomes pretty physically abusive of this little girl into age 2 and 3, often says, "I don't love you. I wish I never had you." By age 9, this little girl has access to both alcohol and drugs in her home and has used not only marijuana and alcohol, but methamphetamine. At age 11, she runs away and spends a little bit of time on her own on the street before going and living with an aunt and uncle. At age 12, she says an uncle tries to sexually assault her. She leaves again and gets engaged with a group of people who are very exploitive, sexually abuse her, physically abuse her. She continues to move around in her young teenage years, still very much engaged with drugs and alcohol. And eventually around age 15 meets a man who she then goes and lives with and has children with in her later teen years and early 20s. So I'm going to pause there and just would ask you to react to the story that I've just told in the chat. What comes up for you? What do you hear about this person? What reactions do you have about the life she's lived this far? Someone wrote sad, heartbroken. Mother and daughter both need protective factors. Hard to hear. She's carrying a heavy load, loneliness, pain, trauma. So just pay attention to those words. So now I'm going to tell you a second story. And this story is about an adult woman. And she's in her mid-20s. She has 4 children. And she's living with her partner at the time. 3 of her children are with a previous relationship, and the 4th is with her current partner. And during this time, CPS, Child Protective Services, gets involved with her family. A teacher of one of her children calls in a report concerned about some bruises on one of her children. CPS goes and visits the home, but the children ultimately stay with this mom who stays with her partner. During the time that this story takes place, the police are also called to the home on a few occasions due to reports of domestic violence. And eventually, this child gets identified in a different light because he becomes the highlight of a national story about child abuse that ends in death and becomes a Netflix special that many of you are familiar with called The Trials of Gabriel Fernandez, which I know is very close to home in your home state of California. So again, I'm going to ask you to react to that second story, and particularly that mom in that second story, whose name is Pearl. Just what comes to mind for you? What's your reaction to her, that story, that experience? Angry, disturbed, someone wrote, isolated, let down by the system. The mom is equally responsible along with the boyfriend. Tragedy, poor coping skills. I've known that mom in my life and in my work, someone wrote. How could she get so disconnected from her child, someone said. So we do this exercise for a reason. These 2 stories are the same person. That little girl is Pearl. That's her life. That's her path. And the question, I'm just going to read a few more. Sadness, broken, evil, no emotions about Pearl. So the question that I want to ask you, and you're welcome to respond in the chat or just think about this, is at what point, if you drew her life as a line, were her experiences and her relationships and her connections supposed to create a way for her to become a great parent for her child? And I think particularly in the context of prevention, which I know is part of the conversation here, and connection, really interesting to think about. The labels that we put, the way that we view people is very much what part of the story we see. And understanding that context can be really important, not to excuse it. I want to be really clear. The intention here is not that we're excusing things that happen to children. That's never true. But instead, at what point did her brain and body learn some of the things that you or I might associate with being a great mom, being a protective factor in her child's life? And I think it's really an interesting exercise. At what age did she learn that? Just think about what in your head happens there. At age 15, 20, when she gives birth to her first child, her 4th, where does that information come from? Where does that dosing come from? Where do those experiences and encounters to learn that behavior come from, to be a great parent like we wish all parents could be? So it's just an interesting thing to think about. I find this exercise to be really powerful in terms of consideration of some of the opportunities we have for prevention and some of the language that I know Kevin's going to get into later. So I'll pause there, but thank you all for engaging with me.
Yeah, what really struck me earlier today, Elizabeth, and why I asked you to do this was the connection you made between the pearls we talked about of good practice and courageous practice and Pearl. And I think our opportunity in the context of building and inhabiting an effective and just child protection system is not possible without remembering Pearl. Pearl lives, as far as we know today, in an institution in California. One of the things I said earlier, and I'll say again, and as we relate to this story, is that as we consider a move to a prevention system, not just a conversation, but the reality, an actionable prevention-focused system, is whom does the prevention system include and who does it exclude? Up to the moment where Gabriel's life was taken, there remained an opportunity for prevention. We want to not talk today about the story of that, because there's a lot more pain to this story than just what we've talked about. As you may know, it's had years of deeper impacts on social workers in Los Angeles, on sheriff's deputies, on others. And so we're not going to get into that, because we're really focused on this revolutionary moment and what we can learn from Pearl, and that can become the pearls of our courageous future practice. And that's where we want to go. And one of the things we do, Elizabeth and I do, is one of the tools that I created is something called mindful positioning. It asks a question of us individually and as institutions and as partners. It asks the question, am I standing in the place where I can do the most good? I think it is very likely with the audience that we have today that you could articulate what the practice tools were that people held and felt like they could make use of in the story of Gabriel Fernandez and his family up to the point of the murder. People, I'm certain, used as best they could the tools they were provided, and we see that in this instance they had a tragic result. I really want to use the idea of mindful position not to reflect on where people stood in those, what we call casework as usual approaches, but where might we stand in the future in a just and highly valued and effective prevention approach. That's where we want to go with this conversation. We're not going to answer the question for you. We're going to give you examples of different answers that various people in the world have come to recently that are really very profound and really exciting, I think. But before we can do that, I need to confront something that I feel confronted by and Elizabeth feels confronted by, is we want to talk about what do we actually know today about the longitudinal impacts of relying upon a foster care focused system or residential care focused system as the tools that we used for child protection when children cannot live safely with a parent. What do we know about that, and what can longitudinal research tell us? So let's look. I'm going to look at a particular study. We have a number of similar sorts of studies that have emerged in the last year or so in the United Kingdom, in South Australia, in 2016 here in the United States with the American Academy of Pediatrics, in Denmark as well. And so let's look at this particular slide you're looking at in a study that was released in July of 2020. It was completed by University College London and King's College London working together. They interviewed about almost 750,000 people who had any experience with foster care, group homes, children's homes, and other accommodations in the child protection system in the United Kingdom between 1971 and 2011. And in these interviews, they wanted to hear from these people who had these care experiences about what was happening with their health and mental health at 10 years after leaving care, at 20 years after care, and 30 years after the care. This is, going to be a group of people who, by the time they're being interviewed, are probably 30-year-olds, 40-year-olds, 50-year-olds approximately. What do we see here? And the first thing that we see is that for people who as children spent any time in foster care or institutional placements between 1971 and 2011, by 10 years after leaving care, 40% of them reported being in very poor health. This means that by age 30, 40% of them were already reporting themselves to be in very poor, very ill health, and both in terms of their physical health and their mental health. By 30 years later, 85%, nearly 9 out of 10 people who spent any time in foster or residential placement between 1971 and 2011 reported themselves to be suffering with what we call in the health field chronic conditions. So chronic means incurable conditions. What conditions are we talking about? We're talking about heart disease, diabetes, of the 80 or more, just over 80 immune system conditions we know about. We know that 40% of those immune conditions are associated with early childhood adversities. That's one of the most common early health changes we see with people who had these experiences. I want to be really clear as we talk about this, clearly cannot be viewed simply as an impact of foster care experiences or residential care. Clearly, it is the impact of those experiences on top of whatever experiences may have happened with their own parents or in their extended family or in the community. But what we know is from this data, is that if we are to think for someone like Gabriel Hernandez, that the solution to Gabriel's situation would have been to remove him more quickly and place him into care, there would be truth to that. It's likely then we would have prevented the murder. But from a health standpoint, that we know that by itself would not have changed what we call a life course health trajectory for Gabriel. Those experiences were shaped his biology, shaped the way his genes are read and transcribed, and would have in all likelihood resulted in health concerns. So we know what we can learn from this particular part of the data is that looking at foster care or other kinds of care settings as a solution to child abuse and neglect experiences in the first family, it's really not, it really can't be seen as a solution. It can be seen for some children as life-saving. I don't think there's any doubt about that, and that matters. But simply saving the life or surviving childhood is not the promise of a prevention-focused system. It is holding the health and the healthy development to, in adulthood, have the opportunities of this democracy. And that's a really important, I think, point. What else do we learn? Well, what we learned from the study is in the UK between 1971 and 2011, if you had involvement with the child protection system and could not stay safely with the parent, but were instead placed in kinship care, meaning placed with someone who knew you or you knew and you knew them, however you might define the legal relationship, for those people who were interviewed at 10 years later, 20 years later, 30 years later, you can see that there was over a 50% reduction in the presence of these chronic incurable diseases by simply having been placed with relatives or someone who knew you and held a relationship of affection with you. That is a profound bit of learning, isn't it? We've had a history of having developed the the narrative and practice of foster care systems. But that really points to the from a public health standpoint, or what we call a population health standpoint, what we could expect to see in terms of longitudinal health and mental health impacts of moving away from a view of foster care as a solution to early life maltreatment, and instead, where children cannot live safely with a parent, placing them with a relative. It doesn't, by the way, this research does not suggest that these placements with relatives were somehow ideal, that they were perfectly fit. It just at population tells us that from a population health standpoint, the move to what Annie Casey and the American Bar Association has called a kin first system, what Los Angeles County through the upfront family finding implementation in LA County is moving to, produces a population health impact that is really quite extraordinary. We're going to back into why these things might be true later, but I really want to just have you sit with that particular data, right? Finally, in what I think has to be seen as data that takes a 400-year-old history of child protection in the Western world, which has been described by some as moving children from bad people to good people, or from bad places to better places, in a way to produce some kind of valued outcome for them. It stands that very idea on its head. In the UK, between 1971 and 2011, where children encountered the child protection system and for some reason were able to stay with that parent or be placed with what we call a non-offending parent, rather than going to kinship care or going to foster care, we see that that by 30 years after leaving the care of that parent, they only experienced a 21% increased presence of these chronic incurable conditions. That is an extraordinary bit of information from a population health standpoint, that there's something. Again, I would point out, when you look at the study, and we're going to provide resources to you guys so you can read these studies and others, there's nothing in the study that says that this outcome was achieved with parents who did particular things or who met a particular standard of child protection that was valued. We're simply talking at population here, a sample of about 165,000 people who had that experience between 1971 and 2011 of staying somehow with the family, with the parent. Now, we don't know that they stayed safely with the parent. We know they stayed with a parent one way or another. And what we know is 30 years later, the increased risk for developing these premature comorbidities or multimorbidities was only increased by 21%, which is actually quite consistent with what we know from the ACEs study about people with ACEs scores of 4 or higher by about age 50 to age 60. So it's absolutely extraordinary in terms of information we need to use as we make good policy focused on prevention and also secondary intervention, I guess. So let's go to the next slide, please. So we want to move a bit here and start to talk about what we've seen. And now I talked about North Yorkshire, which I think is one of the best child protection systems in the world. But I would argue that among the top 2 child protection systems we know of in the world, the other is a place called the Cambodian Children's Trust in Battambang, Cambodia. So this is an entirely different context, right? We're talking what some call the developing world context. We're talking about Cambodia. So we have to understand that when you're encountering families in struggle around safeguarding their children and their own well-being, we're talking about families who are in living memory of genocide. We have to remember that as you were practicing a child protection strategy in the context of a Cambodian community, you're dealing with developing world poverty, which creates its own impacts on health and well-being. but you're also talking about the added impacts of people who live in living memory of an extraordinary um, loss of life and other experiences in the war that occurred in Cambodia after the Vietnam War. It's extraordinary. I want Tara Winkler, who's Australian, is a co-founder of Cambodian Children's Trust. Her colleague, who she founded CCT with, is Cambodian, as are the rest of the team. Look at what Tara said. Tara and I were in Sydney, Australia, a couple of years ago, doing a 4-day boot camp on 200 Aboriginal kids living in hotels in New South Wales at the time. And some had been in those hotels for up to 2 years with rotating staff because they couldn't find placements for them. And we were asked by the state to lead an event to de-hotel those kids. And Tara happened to be in town, and I invited her to come to the event and co-host it with me. And here's something she said, and it really embodies an impact of the Cambodian Children's Trust work. In every instance, the family and the community holds the solution, is what she said. In every instance, the family and the community holds the solution. That is a very hard thing, I think, for me as an American to get my head around as a truth. And yet, what we see in the Cambodian context at CCT is an implementation of a family, a family well-being and child safety approach that believes that the well-being of families and ultimately the safety and health of children and what it takes to do that is within the ability of families and their communities to imagine and to act on. And that is the positioning that they're taking. Let me offer something I think is profoundly important about the prevention strategy of Cambodian Children's Trust. Rather than viewing child safety and the involvement of the formal system in a family's life as occurring when there's a hotline call, in other words, waiting until there's something of such concern that a call is made to the hotline. And I should say they do operate a hotline, but in addition to that, their community view, that what the community said across the Battambang region about what they wanted in a child protection system is they wanted as a community to be able to talk about what they already knew. They knew who the families were in almost every case. They already knew who the families are that were at risk. They knew who was hungry. They knew where the screaming and yelling was coming from. They knew where the addiction was active already. And their approach was to canvass as a community repeatedly villages for any sign of any family in distress well before there's ever a hotline call, and to get the right service at the right time to families in the context of a belief that says they hold the solution to the problems that most affect their lives, not a social worker. One last thing about CCT's extraordinary work. When they do a child protection intervention of support with families, they provide a social worker, or sometimes what they call a lay social worker. But you know, it's profound. In most instances, while you'll get a social worker or a lay social worker, most families get 3 finance workers. And what they've come to view is to recognize how much economics drives hardship and the ability of families to have the economic well-being to lift off the kind of unrelenting stressors that parents face in the context of inequality, grinding developing world poverty and trauma, not only immediately in their lives, but the trauma of the living memory of genocide. That an economic solution that is sustainable by the family is the best predictor of safety in the future for children. That's an extraordinary investment. We think about economic needs in families as the ability to broker and advocate for them to get an entitlement program. They believe that each family has the potential to be an enterprise, to find where their talents fit a need in the community, where their passions fit, and to invent a way of making a living that brings strong meaning and purpose to their lives, an identity and a contribution in the community, and provides for the economic resources to be able to really focus their attention on teaching their children, loving their kids, and loving one another. It's an extraordinary view. Let's go to the next slide, please. And I'm going to need help with reminding me about time because I've completely lost sight of it. Let me read from the Cambodian Children's Trust website about an upstream versus a downstream approach. Listen to the view. This is their argument for prevention. People standing by a river see children being washed down a fast-flowing stream. They jump in to save children from drowning. One by one, they begin pulling them to safety. The children who are pulled from the river are badly hurt and will bear the scars for the rest of their lives. There are not enough people to reach all the children, so many slip through. Other people who witness this happening don't jump in the river to join and rescue. Instead, they head upstream to find out why so many children are falling in. They then begin implementing interventions to prevent the children from falling in the river in the first place. Soon enough, there are so few children in the river that much of the downstream response is no longer required. Now, when a child does fall in the river, the downstream response is not overburdened and can ensure no child ever slips through again. That is the vision of Cambodian Children's Trust and the action of the trust in terms of their community-driven, what they call village hive model. It's extraordinary. And it creates a space for a recognition that and if I could tie this again, it's very difficult, but back to Gabriel Hernandez, even if we had pulled him out of the river, he would have been badly hurt for a lifetime. And clearly we didn't pull him out of the river and he lost his life. We need to have a robust prevention approach that is well-resourced. People hold extraordinary skill and knowledge and really know how to activate their capacities as practitioners to unlock the untapped human potential in people rather than simply stand on the sidelines and make an assessment of the harm. I've made an argument for years. The neighbors can tell us about the problems in families' lives. That's no achievement. When we do get involved, we've got to be able to bring a meaningful response to that hardship and to that suffering and view it broadly and effectively in terms of developing an ultimately an effective approach. Let's look at the next work is from New South Wales. This is New South Wales is where Sydney is, and I was privileged to help. I was just going on 4 years ago. The state to develop a new child protection model and implement it with Aboriginal First Nations families. Listen to the language that is used in the practice of child protection and prevention work in New South. The first construct is, and this is from their work, walking on sacred ground. Here's a question that protection workers really have to ask. Are we working to catch people at their worst or to get them to their best? That's a really interesting, wiser question, isn't it? The question, are we working to catch people at their worst, fails us. The community can do that. The family can do that. The teacher can do that. But what can the child protection professional do? What can the mental health practitioner do? What can the juvenile justice professional do? How can we work with people to get them to their best and the opportunity to live a good life in this democracy? Is a really profoundly important question, and quite frankly, worth devoting a sacred life to doing. My comment to the right is what we've seen with family finding. We learned how to find families. 94% of the longest waiting children in the American system, we were able to find 5 to 8 adults who would come to the table for them. But what we found is when they came to the table in our casework as usual history, they weren't welcome. And I do a talk sometimes called Invited but Unwelcome. Inviting people to the table is not the same as welcoming and valuing. That language, in every instance the family holds the solution, is the language of value. Inviting people to the table to tell us what their plan is, and we'll determine whether we accept that plan, is not about welcoming or valuing. It's about extracting. It's transacting. It isn't about welcoming, valuing, or seeing. The next slide, please. Again, from New South Wales. We will speak to families with respect and about them as if they are in the room. I started my family finding research in 1999, 2000, around 3 questions. Is it really true the longest waiting children in the American system have no one and never had a father? Is it true that social workers in the American system and their partners are so overburdened that even if these people existed, they didn't have time to find them? And finally, if we did find these people, would they be safe and would they be caring? And the answer was, for 94% of people, we found them. Caseworkers found them, social workers found them, probation officers found them, foster parents found them, CASA volunteers found them, mental health professionals found them, judges and lawyers found them. And the last question, they not only did they come to the table, they came running, but running into what? A prevention system that will have any meaning cannot be a replication of the system that we've had. It is really not about a child protection system that looks at people through the lens of appropriateness to decide whether they are appropriate, whether they meet a standard. We think that families in their community and their culture should be at the table, not because they are appropriate, because they deserve the dignity to have something to say about the government's impact on their family, that they have the potential and capabilities to do this. And in order to do it, they have to be welcomed. That means we have to confront how we talk about people, how we think about people. And as we say today, not family finding, but family seeing. How do we see people? I want you to think about the pain this country's in right now. Some describe it in the simplest terms about equity and inclusion, but that may be sanitizing language for what we're really talking about. But we can't ignore in this prevention conversation that we're as complicit in this nation's original sin around racism as any other system is, as any other individuals are. And without talking about that, we're not having a serious conversation about prevention and about valuing human life. What I learned in my home, in my family finding research, is no one ever believed that kids had no father. No one ever believed that they had no relatives. What we were acculturated to believe is these were people that did not count for much. And in order to get to any kind of promise of prevention, that core problem has to be confronted squarely and courageously and together. The next slide, please. Some language from Kate Alexander, the Office of the Senior Practitioner in New South Wales. Beware of words that minimize people's experiences, that mutualize. Here's one that's lovingly said in child protection, but is an example of a damaging form of mutualizing when we call someone else's children our kids, our families. That's mutualizing language. And while it may be well-intended, it is devastating language. Pathologizing people as drug addicts, as alcoholics, people as mentally ill, as pathologizing language that flattens people's experiences, very quickly turning them into objects rather than full, capable people ready to be the authors of their own lives. sanitizing language, tell the truth about the harm, use good, plain language. With one of the problems of sanitizing language is we often miss the urgency. Family violence does not come close to describing what was really happening in Gabriel Fernandez's house. And unfortunately, we become so surrounded by the story of family violence, we fail sometimes to recognize its actual impact, and we miss the moment. Bureaucratizing language that is about systems rather than about lives and possibilities. I'm borrowing from Judaism. I said this: words create worlds. In Judaism, that power of that statement, words create worlds, has a very particular meaning. God spoke the world into being in Genesis chapter 1. And it is a profound notion of the idea of words creating worlds, but it has relevance for us. The words we use create worlds for children and parents, and they have to live with them. The language of pathologizing people, of bureaucratizing, sanitizing, mutualizing, and minimizing people's experiences and their gifts create worlds that children and parents have to live with. We have to model language that is thick and broad and welcoming and holds more than a single truth. It is true that there may be violence in this family. It is also true that the people in that family deserve, in their relationship with the government, to experience dignity. Both things can be true. To explain something is not to excuse something, is language I've also heard. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide, please. I want to mention a movement I've been involved with, which is a movement called Inseparable Us. I was involved with them during the campaign this last year for the presidential election. They were kind enough to reach out to me, and they've been very effective in helping the Biden administration recruit appointees for the Biden administration, particularly at the Health and Human Services Department. This is a movement founded by Zach Williams, a person whose name you won't know, but you do know his dad. His dad's name was Robin Williams. And as you know, Robin Williams took his own life 6 years ago. And Zach has been behind, and his siblings, behind a movement with a man by the name of Bill Smith, something called Inseparable Us, which really is about the family's experience of the story that emerged about how Robin Williams' life ended. And it was a story, sadly, that connects to an old, thin, worn idea of, I apologize for this language, I'm borrowing it, but the language of kind of the sad clown. The idea that sometimes some of the funniest people among us are the ones who also suffer the most, as a narrative of understanding the Mr. Williams's death. But in truth, what really happened was that Mr. Williams was suffering from a profoundly destructive physical disease that contributed strongly to how his life ended. And what we're talking about here is one of the things we're going to have to confront in a meaningful and just approach to prevention is to not continue to dismember humans and families in the way we see them. And what Inseparable Us is about, they sometimes say health is health. In other words, mental health is health. Physical health is health. We can't disembody and do a neck up approach to thinking about health and well-being in people. We need to see the super system in a particular context, Inseparable Us. And this begins to move us to, as we head towards wrapping up, to this idea of the power of connection. What is that about? And what does that have to do with imagining and constructing a just, dignity-filled, justice-doing prevention system? And that gets us to our last little bit here. And I hope we have a minute and a half to watch this video, Elizabeth. Let's watch. This is a Californian by the name of Daniel Siegel, who's at UCLA. And he's got a minute and a half in his unique way to tell a story as a psychiatrist about something we can take away from today's conversation that I think you might find really helpful in the way you work with families and think about work with families? Go ahead and play this, please.
Living the lie that the self is separate is a form of impaired integration. Because the reality is we are all, yes, differentiated as a me, but we're all linked as a we, only society and science don't tell us that. And so for me, what I tried to do in the Brainstorm book and what I try to do now in my talks is say, well, how do you honor the differences? You do have a personal history, and that's a me, but you also have an interconnectedness, that's a we. So it isn't getting rid of a me, it's combining the two into one. So you can use the term we, M-W-E. And we is what I think our identity should be. I'm a me and a we at the same time. And if we can get we into schools and into families and into literally the way you live, people realize that helping others is helping the self. Helping the planet is helping the self. The self is not in your body. The self is a distributed, interconnected system, and the body is just one node. And the amazing thing is, all the studies of longevity and happiness, you know, they show that when you live a life realizing you're interconnected, you're going to be happier and healthier. It's a win-win-win thing, and there's just a lie that's being perpetrated by society and science that I feel the mindfulness movement is building inner resilience and interconnectivity, and that's the empowerment that we need to promote.
So let me frame what Dr. Siegel just said. He's told the story this particular way for more than 100 years. Psychiatrists, psychologists, philosophers have been, am I doing, Elizabeth, am I connected still? Okay. Have been confronting the question of what is the self? And what Siegel's talking about is a particular view today of the concept of the self, that the self is distributed, that there is an individual biography of me, and then there are the people who I'm closest to in my life, and the health of the self is a measure of both things. Now let's apply that particular viewpoint to Gabriel Fernandez's mom, Pearl, her partner, and Gabriel and the others in the family. What might we think about the degree of isolation that they were viewed to be in, the entire story of their lives and how that life has been reflected? We say, here's one of our 3 principles: our biography is our biology. How do we view the relative health of the family, and the relative health of the selves in the family as part of our viewpoint of risk and our viewpoint of healing? And so that notion of the self, I talked at the beginning about the research from England on people who spent any time in foster institutional care as children and what happens to the health of these people later. Think about the problem with a view that the self is distributed and the very idea of forcible removals of children from their parents, families, culture, and community. And what that might mean if you believe the idea that the overall well-being or health of the individual is really a measure of the health of the individual within a context of relationships. This sounds neck up. It sounds like a philosophy, maybe. It sounds like a psychological theory. It is probably. But I want you to do something else, which is I want you to then connect this to the body. Elizabeth and I, in our work about family meeting practices and what's different about our view of family meeting practices is not family meeting practices and child protection as a way to extract something from the family in terms of whether they can make a plan we will accept or will not accept. But we think about the family meeting practice as directly associated with this idea that the family meeting practice is an investment in the self as a distributed self, in the well-being of the family and their ability to sit together, to sit together with their community, to sit together with those who support them, schools, others who may provide support to the family in natural occurring ways. What is that relationship like? I was sharing this morning with our English colleagues. I did my original research working for Catholic Community Services here at the Seattle Archdiocese. And you wouldn't probably know this about them, but in 1973, that's where a model called Home Builders was launched. In the very office that I developed family finding in was the office that Home Builders was built in. And the reason I bring up that story is one of the first stories I heard about the work in 1973 of Home Builders. And by the way, Home Builders important in the prevention conversation because it's one of a relative handful of models that have been approved by the federal government in the Families First. I'm sure, what's the name of it, Elizabeth? I'm sorry, I'm blocking it, but the
FFPSA, Families First Prevention Services Act.
And then they created the group that approves what models are funded and aren't.
The clearinghouse?
Yeah. So look, without dispute, family, I would bring this up, without dispute, really, with very strong evidence, Home Builders was very early accepted in the clearinghouse as a model the states can use. And I'm talking not about the state of the evidence of Home Builders today, but I'm talking about the first story happened and began to happen in 1973. And I remember the first story I heard, I knew a man by the name of Gene Matsusaka was still working with the charities organization when I was working with them in the mid 90s. And Gene had the original idea that led to Home Builders. And his idea, which was not unusual in the early 70s, there were a lot of movements around this, was if an hour of therapy is good for a parent who's at risk of losing their children to the government, how good would 24 hours a day for a month be? And so he changed the job of their workers, which were largely nuns, what we call social service nuns at the time, from seeing individual patients as therapists to getting only one family and moving in with them for a month. And the stories that came out of the original Home Builders work of what happened when these nuns lived with these families, usually moms and their kids without a dad at home. I know you're shocked. The stories of transformation of these little families in just 30 days time were just mind blowing. The day they would say their goodbyes, these kids looked like shiny new pennies. Their moms had not been feeling this well, this hopeful. Their housing problems were solved. The original training of Home Builders workers taught Home Builders workers how to fix holes in drywall and how to repair broken doors that had been kicked in by violent partners. I mean, this was an extraordinary thing to do in the 1970s. But the problem was that what we saw in the early days was that what happened after the nun left, these people look like shiny pennies, as I said, everything was better. But what happened later? And very often, unfortunately, too often in the early days, a lot of those moms and their kids found themselves later involved with child protection. There was something that didn't stick. And in fact, that's what led to the development later in the same office of what became known as family preservation services. The idea was when the Catholics looked at, well, why did Home Builders not stick in the early days? The clinicians had an answer. And the answer was that 30 days is not long enough for parents to internalize our fantastic clinical care for people. And of course, it begged the question 10 years later, if it wasn't long enough, what would be long enough? And the answer was 90 days. Home Builders moves into family pres. What I thought and what led to the building of family finding was maybe it's not about clinical treatment at all. That's not what explains, first of all, what the resilience sciences call the bounce back or bounce forward of people in that home over 30 days. And then what happens later, maybe it was something else. Maybe it's this. Maybe there's a person, a human on the planet who cares enough about you, whoever they are, to leave the life they live every day, roll up a sleeping bag, pack a bag with clothes, and move in your house and sleep on the floor for 30 days. If there's a crying baby and mom's not getting sleep, gets up and cares for the baby. When somebody shows up in the middle of the night, intoxicated, pounding on the door, wanting to see mom, you answer the door and you ask them lovingly to leave. to help mom fix something broken in the house before the landlord catches it. Maybe it's not clinical care. Maybe it is the presence of that kind of force in your life that really mattered. And that raised a question for me, which we had been operating a child protection system in foster care and in group homes, and we knew what was happening by this point to aging out young people. And what my original family finding work, I was asking a question in my own mind, and that question was, who would be more likely to make that kind of fierce commitment to the well-being of a family, not just right now, but over time? And that question for me was, would it be family? Would it be people like family who you held a relationship of affection with? Or would it be strangers that we recruited past a home study and were appropriate? And what we have seen is the clear answer to that question. It is the family, and it is people in the community who know you or don't know you, but share something with you: membership in a tribe, a shared faith, a shared language, a shared culture, shared membership in a community. A very interesting recent experience Elizabeth and I've been connected to in Canada was taking 20 parents facing child abuse and neglect investigations and child removals. And rather than the caseworker working individually with each of these families and trying to get that engagement and work through the process, bring, if with their permission, the 20 parents and their partners into a room together to develop an intentional community of people all facing the same risks, who know each other's struggle, who feel unable to turn to people who love them out of a sense of shame or out of a burned bridge, as we often call it. And that intentional community becoming the first place of safety, where parents facing these experiences can feel acceptance in that moment and begin to build on one another's action towards restoring their lives. What did we see in the Woodstock example of this with our friend Dan Martin? Was that more children reunified much, much faster when parents found their recovery, not alone with the social worker, but within a community of other people who were also working for recovery of their lives and the restoration of their dignity. We can point to, and I recognize, I believe we're scheduled until 1 o'clock, but I want to make sure we leave time for a conversation with people and reactions. But I want to say what we're seeing in the United States and in other places in the world are extraordinary, mind-blowing examples of transformation. Can I give you one in Pennsylvania, where Elizabeth is in Philadelphia? Elizabeth's in Philadelphia, and Philadelphia is a recent partner in this process, but we are in year 4 with the Pennsylvania Supreme Court of what they call a family engagement initiative that at this point involves 14 counties. And we're doing I did a model revision in 2015, and we've been implementing the model revision in those 14 counties. And let me just get to the punchline. In the 14 counties right now, county child protection agencies like California, the average county has reduced the use of foster care placements in the last 4 years by 90%. 2 of them have reduced it by 99%, moving in a very powerful way from a historic view of a foster care system as the primary tool of child protection, where children can't stay safely with families, to right at the first encounter with families, bringing them in the room and keep bringing them in the room as they construct solutions to the problems that face their lives. What's been very interesting is a number of the counties in that project have been deeply affected by opioid addiction crises in their communities. And a lot of these are families where the primary reason that the agencies are knocking on the door is an overdose death, is a near death, is very severe neglect, deplorable conditions. And I can tell you for 64% of those families, that network that comes running has that first meeting within 24 hours of the knock on that door. And in the remainder of the time, they will do it within 72 hours. And the result of that kind of urgency of child protection, not seeing itself as we call the doers of all things, holding the responsibility for all the activities, but instead as facilitators, as conveners, as catalysts for family healing, looking at family gatherings as the place where healing can be constructed and often the place where we practice healing. The self, remember the distributed self, not the individual cut out of the herd, outside of relationships with others or working on those relationships, but instead within those relationships in a place of safety, leaning in to what hurts, and being supported has been extraordinarily powerful. I'm going to mention one last thing I didn't put in the slide, who's someone you will know about, a man by the name of Rob Anda. Dr. Anda, you may know, is a co-author of the ACEs study that was released in the early 90s that was done in California. And as you may know, Vince Folletti was, Dr. Folletti from San Diego was the other person in the research. But Anda went on to do something very interesting after the work of the ACEs study. That was the development of a model with Laura Porter called self-healing communities that actually started here in Washington State in the county I grew up in, which you wouldn't know, but you know something about that county, which is there's a volcano there called Mount St. Helens. My neighborhood I grew up in as a kid was destroyed in that eruption. The destruction stopped literally at the front door of my house as a kid. And you could imagine the impact in that rural community of the loss of natural resource jobs with the closing of the woods due to over harvesting timber, the destruction of fish runs, the destruction that was wrought by a very large volcanic eruption. There were many social problems there, and Anda and Porter constructed what they call the self-healing communities intervention that you can read about, and we provided the links to those materials and you'll be able to read them. But I want to just finish and then we'll get into question and answer with something very specific about what Anda does. You remember that Anda's coming off the ACEs study where they teach something that actually our grandparents probably tried to teach all of us, which would be that, not surprisingly, the more harmful things that happen to a child in childhood, the more likely it is that you'll have health problems later. Only they do it empirically beyond just their observation. But Anda doesn't take what he learns in ACEs and view it as the idea that we need to count the number of injuries that happen to kids so that we know, what our intervention ought to be. Listen to what's different about Anda's theory of change for self-healing communities. Here's what he says. He says that the dominant system, the system we continue to operate in, has a theory of change that goes something like this. Governments exist to solve social problems, and the result is the creation of social welfare institutions and their contractors, for profit and otherwise, that see themselves as the authors of solution of particular social welfare problems in states and in localities. What the self-healing communities model theory of change was this: parents and grandparents are the change agents in the lives of children, and governments exist to support them to do that. And the entire self-healing communities model was built around belief in that idea that parents and grandparents are the change agents of the lives of their children, and government and their partners exist to help them to be that. And I think that's what prevention's about, as we think about this extraordinary moment we're in to move into, in our lifetimes, a new, exciting, and dignity-filled opportunity to tell our families about the work we devoted our lives to doing. That, I think, there's something right about that idea and these other ideas. And let me go over them again. In every instance, the family and the community holds the solution. That the self is a distributed self. To understand a healthy person is to recognize the health not only of the individual, but the relationships and membership they hold in it and together. And where there's health problems, violence, and others, the idea is to bring the distributed self together. And finally, Anda's notion, governments exist to support parents and grandparents to be the change agents in the lives of their children. Governments do not exist to create solutions to the governed's problems. That has been something we've been trying to do since the Beveridge Report in 1940, that was enacted in 1947, and that has resulted in a decades-old narrative of brokenness when it comes to our social welfare systems. So I'll stop there, and maybe we could have some help and have a conversation. And Elizabeth, please do jump in. So I think there might have been some questions in the chat, maybe.
Hi. Yes.
Yes, please.
So,
And what's your name, by the way?
hi, my name is Mara Sainio, and I'm with the Office of Child Abuse Prevention. Thank you for speaking this afternoon, or this morning / afternoon. I'm just opening the chat box. It minimized when we stopped sharing your screen. So we have a few questions so far, and hopefully people can chime in and type in their questions if they have additional ones. First question from Marina. Oftentimes we see the families wanting to help, but at the same time, they might go through difficult times. Are the families going through a vetting process to ensure the child or children put in the relative's home are not abused?
Well, thank you for bringing that up. That's a really wise and critical question. I am so glad we're starting there. Let me offer a perspective that helps, I think. And I apologize because I always feel like this language begins in a way that's somewhat inadequate, but it's the best I've got for you. And on that, so let's look at that question. I think that idea of it gets to what I said about appropriateness, right? The casework as usual evolved tradition is to look at the ability of parents, of family members, even siblings sometimes, and their ability to participate around this view about are they appropriate or not appropriate. And let's be clear, what do we mean by that? Appropriate to be safe with the child, right? That's a critical question. And that is the way I think we have evolved a set of practices. Let me use the language I use in teaching people and Elizabeth and I use, is that we call casework as usual a set of practices we call exclusionary practices based in government power. That view, are people safe enough? Are they appropriate to be with a child? That is not an unimportant question, right? We have to ensure this immediate safety of people we work with. And so here's how I would navigate that. And it's what I call delinking. I think it is, we have to, as I talked about holding two truths, we have to hold two truths. The question is critical. Are people safe to be with a child is a question that we have to confront. But you have to de-link that question from the question of the dignity of people to participate in a process. And I think we have to hold both things. You have to practically confront the question about safety and appropriateness, including meeting your obligations under the law. And at the same time, we need to convene families and offer the dignity and opportunity to come to the table. I'll add one more thing to this that I didn't get to today. That in addition to the question and the important word of child safety, the word safety, we think it's critical to add the word healing. And that when we add the healing, it really thickens the opportunity. So here's a different way of thinking about what I've just said. Let's say that we de-link. We are dealing practically with the safety strategies around the child, which may include keeping them away from particular family members for a time or maybe forever. That may be happening. But we are also engaging those folks, including those people we may be excluding, in coming to the table to confront the problems that might most affect their lives with a belief that healing is possible. One last thing about this. I think in 2 weeks, Bruce Perry and Oprah Winfrey have a new book coming out. I think it's part of the title is What Happened to You. Elizabeth and I are going to be interviewing Bruce about his book on May 3rd, and you'll be able to watch that interview on our website in the near future, familyfinding.org. Here's what Bruce Perry said to Oprah Winfrey a couple of weeks ago at South by Southwest. Listen to this very short but powerful statement from Bruce Perry. Healing is always possible. And I want you to think about that as you think about Pearl today in a prison in California, Gabriel's mother. What would the doing of that belief look like in working with Pearl? If healing is always possible, how do we apply that thinking to inmates on the inside of institutions who will be citizens on the outside of institutions most of the time? What does the doing of that truth look like? That's what Elizabeth and I are working on. And it is a lot of things. It is no one thing. But it begins with believing that healing is actually possible. And here's the point about the topic today about the power of connections. Healing cannot happen outside of relationships. It can't. And we learn how to safely navigate human relationships by practicing having them. And sometimes in the worst child safety experiences that we will deal with as statutory agencies, it will require bringing people to the table who need that healing most if we're ever going to get anything close to what looks like safety in our communities. So de-link the question of child safety, deal with it, but don't ignore the power of encounter and the ability to bring people together and their work to construct healing in their lives. So what else do we have?
Sure. We have a question from Tara, and Tara says, I am interested in your statement regarding inviting families to participate being not the same as welcoming and valuing.
Yes.
Can you speak to any examples where that is happening in practice and what that looks like?
Yeah, well, there are lots of them. In Pennsylvania, I mentioned the 14 counties that are in this work that the Supreme Court is facilitating and the courts. What they have done that's resulted in that reduction of the use of out-of-home care for kids is do that delinking process, bring people to the table, especially people who need healing most to the table, and keep them there, not around the conversation of itself, of who can be safe with this child or who will take placement of this child, but instead ask the question, what are the healing needs in your family? How would you do that? Let me give you an example you can find on the internet, a website called untilthelastchild.org. And that's a Canadian charity that I've led research with. And we did a project about 4 years ago in Manitoba. Elizabeth and I are now doing follow-up work in Manitoba. And it was 200 First Nations and Métis children languishing in care in emergency placements in Manitoba, some of them for up to 16 years. And I want you to put that language together. Living as a child in an emergency placement for 16 years. That is a profound statement by itself when you think about what that might mean. And the result of that work is that we said, don't bring First Nations and Métis families together who were affected by colonization, by racism, over and not just individually now, but generationally over hundreds of years, and the suffering they experience in their lives as a result of colonization. Don't bring them to the table about how do we get a child out of foster care. There's a bigger, wiser question to be asked in that moment as government, which is, what would your family say are the healing needs in your family, given this generational experience of colonization and racism and dismembering, and its effects as it results in addiction and family violence and sexual violence of generations of children removed by the government and placed into institutions and adoptions. That's the reason to bring people to the table. And that's exactly what we coached Manitoba state professionals to do. And the long and the short of it is that 76% of those 200 children exited the Manitoba system over the 2 years of that study and returned to their First Nations communities, sometimes to their First Nations families, sometimes on reserve with other members of the nation, in a whole variety. By the way, 32% of those kids stayed with the emergency providers in adoptions and guardianships, because the First Nations family and the emergency placement recognized that they had become the only families these children actually ever knew, and that collectively they believed that those adoptions were in the best interest of those kids, but that broader membership in their First Nations community and family would be critical to their future well-being, because First Nations community had seen what had happened to children who had suffered what was called the 60 scoop experience and were sold to white families in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and had to find their way home to their First Nations communities and heal those relationships themselves. That's another example of what we've seen. We're at this point not talking about hypotheticals here. We're talking about examples we can point to across 4 continents, where when we practice that idea that families hold the solution, it's evidence that they do. And finally, I would just back to the question itself. What do I want to say? Oh, shoot. Can you ask the question again? Because there was something she said I want to specifically ask and I lost it. Can you read it again?
Yes, Tara was asking about your statement around inviting families to participate being not the same as welcoming and valuing.
Yeah.
Can you speak to any examples of where it's happening in practice?
Right. Again, examples: Cambodian Children's Trust, Los Angeles County, Upfront Family Finding Research, Travis County, Texas, Hidalgo County, Texas, North Yorkshire, England, go on. But let me talk about that language, invited but unwelcome. Isabel Wilkeson wrote a book called The Warmth of Other Suns, and won the first African-American woman to win a Pulitzer Prize for this extraordinary work. And what she was talking about was the what's called the Great Migration. African-American families in the South after Reconstruction, and who were lured effectively to Western states and Northern states by industry as a cheap source of labor and a way to break unions that had formed during the labor movement. And the language invited but unwelcome comes from Isabel's work. And it was what families had experienced was this, what became known as the James Crow laws. They came to these Western and Northern cities on the promise of being welcomed out of the violence of Jim Crow and lynching in the South, to find that in fact they were being exploited as ways to break unions and as a source of cheap labor. They weren't really welcome. They had been invited, but they were unwelcome. And unfortunately, what we saw with the first 10 years of research on family finding was that we could almost always bring the family to the table. And it was almost always true that the legacy system didn't know what to do with them. That meant, and that resulted in something we called, one young person in the research called the wood chipper. And so what we're saying today, and this has this particular meaning for prevention work, is there's work to be done. We can't simply take a step into the future and say that we're going to work differently with families. We really have to interrogate what that actually means. And it actually means placing a value on them. You actually have to believe that people are the only place you're going to find solutions, rather than coming to believe, can you be like the foster parents I trust, or can you act like a therapist? Can you behave by our rules? Because unfortunately, those rules are influenced strongly by privilege and can't be separated from our history. So go ahead, the next question, please.
Yeah, so we're actually getting a lot of comments in about the story of Gabriel Hernandez and his mother,
Good.
And her partner. And I think people are curious to know what your thoughts are on that case and kind of what the ending of that case was. And I'm not sure that everyone actually was familiar with it previously. And so we have gotten a couple of comments asking for your opinion on the film or the documentary.
Elizabeth, why don't you react to the film?
I think the film is a beautiful version of a single story, which we talk a lot about in family finding. And single stories can be true stories, by the way. Single story doesn't denote that it's not true. It's just a very myopic view. And again, Kevin used this language at the beginning. Understanding something does not excuse it. Having a concept around the why does not make something okay. Netflix special or not, I think probably everybody who's in this space today agrees that children should be able to be safe and have good lives and not be abused. And for me, that's not the argument, but I'm reading the chat here as well. I think it would be very interesting. So the chat featured, in case you've missed it, Kevin, as you've been talking, is a lot about, is it really Pearl's responsibility to save her child from her monster boyfriend and not watch her son be abused? Again, I would ask you, when did she learn how to do that? How to ask for help, how to protect her child, how to be a parent? When was she to learn how to do that? Kevin shared something with me the other day that strikes me here about the different experience of people. I think it was originally in reference to inequality, but applies here. So 3 groups of people in the rain. First group has an umbrella. Second group knows how to build an umbrella. Third group doesn't even know an umbrella is an option. And I'm going to make the argument, and this is my personal opinion, but I'm going to make the argument here that she did not have access to that. And we're very good as helping professionals about thinking about this from the cognition, but I would guess, just based on my minimum observation of her, that she doesn't have a lot of access to a cognitive self. That if we were sitting with somebody like Pearl right now, that would be a really hard conversation to have, because we got to start in the body. And I'll just add one particular other piece here, which is I could have easily told this story instead of about Pearl, about Isaro, who's Pearl's boyfriend in the Netflix special, the other person who participated in this abuse, and how comforting it is for each of us to be able to say, well, it's his fault, he's the monster, or it's her fault, she failed to protect her child. Those things can be true. They may be true, but they are single stories. And I believe there's a fuller, thicker story of that life, that family, those experiences. I'd be very curious what his early life was. Again, not an excuse. Doesn't mean it's okay to hurt anyone, ever, particularly children. But it does give some insight into how we might be thinking about prevention even now for these two people, both of whom are in prison, one of whom is waiting for a death penalty, is there an opportunity for prevention? I think so.
Well, it's a challenging conversation, and we need to deal with it because we have prisons filled with people. And by the way, the majority of whom were maltreated children themselves.
Yeah.
It's, you know, we imprison more people than any country on the planet. What's happening here? It's no small issue, and we don't get to ignore it because it's something that our communities are living with every day. I don't have a particular opinion about the case itself, because I don't think it matters what my opinion about the case is. And I certainly, I just want to repeat again what we said, is to understand or explain what we think may have been happening there in no way excuses it. It is it is horrific, and everyone associated with it has suffered and will continue to suffer. What I want to look at is, and I said this morning in our English group's conversation, and I think somebody said it earlier in the chat. If you're in any way doing work right now that is working with families who are involved with the child protection system, you are very likely working with a future Pearl or her partner right now. And what I'm really interested in is, how do we change that story by changing what our work is and how we inform our work? And let me offer 3 principles that we built our work around. That this is why we work with, as consultants with a health company, and are working on big implementations in the States around health plans. Here's 3 principles that are a beginning place. The first is, what is predictable is preventable. Think about the 2 stories of Pearl that you heard. Given what you heard about Pearl's extraordinary childhood of suffering at every turn, could we have predicted the sort of mothering practice that she might have carried out? Could we have predicted the kind of relationships of intimacy that she might have found herself a part of? Well, certainly we could never make an absolute prediction, but at a high level, we could absolutely have made that prediction. So here's our principle. What is predictable is preventable. We've got to learn how to stand in our authority and not just look at what is happening immediately and what we might do about it, but to think about what has happened in the past, what is happening in the present, and what we know, given the research we now have, is likely to happen in a decade, 2 decades, or 3 decades. Let me give you an example from Harvard Center on the Developing Child of what they've been saying for a decade about child protection. They have been saying that when we meet a child, and I would add when you meet a parent, you shouldn't simply look at an assessment about what is happening now. You need to imagine an assessment to what they call the midpoint of life. And the midpoint of life is defined as age 60. How would this, what we call a life course health trajectory, likely unfold, if it will remain unchanged between the point we're meeting somebody and their 60th year of life? And I have to say, if you don't like the assessment, the time to do something about that is right now. And that is a very hard but critical conversation to have with families. Is not just to focus in the now, it is to be thinking about the future. We think that's critical. The second principle about it applies to healing. The brain and the body want to heal. The first thing to understand when we talk about healing is not what our health system has led us maybe to believe. And let me say something about human health that we know, again, working with health firms. 80% of what happens to people's physical health and mental health across the life course is shaped by how you live your life every day and what happened in your early childhood. Only 20% for most people of what happens to your health are deeply influenced by your interactions with the formal healthcare system. Pay attention to that when you think about what we mean by prevention. If we continue to think about prevention as the ability to shop for the right model, match it to the right family, and launch that thing at them in a period of days or weeks or months, and get a particular outcome and ignore the larger context of people's lives, we are not likely to develop a prevention system that in fact achieves the promise. There's got to be more going on there. And that is not to say that these models couldn't have value. It's simply to say the models by themselves probably have very limited value. We have to look at the larger context. And the first thing we need to remember is the brain and the body want to heal. The body is always working at right-sizing itself or righting itself like a ship filling with water. It's always constantly working at righting itself, constantly making adaptation. That's what we understand epigenetics to be about. And will always do that in response to the quality of the relationships people are having and the overall experience in the environment. And that's what we're learning about really paying attention to what's happening with kids and families. What's happening with the relational experience has happened, what's happening now, what might happen in the future, what is the environmental context, and recognizing that when the relationships and environments are within tolerance of people's biological needs, that the brain and the body can do some extraordinary things in terms of making adaptation to that. And that the reverse is true, that where relationships are deeply injurious, where people are, through socially constructed experiences are suffering from persistent inequality, hate, racism, the fact that housing is not equitably available, employment, that's going to create its own consequences in terms of health and well-being and even on mortality. And we need to really think about that as we construct what prevention looks like. So I better shut up in case we've got time for anything else.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We certainly did have some additional questions. However, we realized that a lot of people have to go to other meetings at 1 o'clock, and we would like to invite Angela back at this time to give some final remarks. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Kevin. You've shared so much wisdom with us today. And in fact, not only shared wisdom, but I believe it was provocative. We can see that by the chat that people have emotional responses to some of the things that have been shared today. And it makes me, realize how we all have different perspectives and points of view that come up around this subject and the importance of having this discussion and opening up the difficult conversations, if you will. So I really appreciate you doing that for us today. I also want to say that I wrote down from the beginning of the presentation, we are moving into a meaningful and actionable conversation about prevention. And truly, I believe that set the tone of what we've experienced today. So again, thank you so much for that. I just want to share with all of our attendees from today that we are going to have another webinar next Wednesday. And I'm really excited about our presenter. His name is Corey Best. And I think it'll be another provocative conversation about race and equity and connection. So the theme will continue, and I hope that all of you will join us on next Wednesday at 11, from 11 to 1. And then the following week on April 28th, we're going to have a panel of myself, Sheila Boxley, Ron Brown from Children's Bureau, and Katie Albright from Safe and Sound, that are going to open up further conversations and discussions that we hope will be provocative, because this is a time of change and transformation. and really evaluating our thoughts and our ideas and our beliefs that are influencing our work. And so it's a privilege to be able to offer these speakers to you during Child Abuse Prevention Month and to challenge our thinking. So with that, I just want to say goodbye, and I hope to see you again next week. Thank you again, Kevin and Elizabeth, for joining us today.
Thanks.
Goodbye.
Thank you all. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Yeah.
Thank